How Jesus inspired change through history. When researchers analyzed the founding documents of major humanitarian organizations worldwide, they discovered that approximately 75% of charitable giving in the United States stems from religious faith, a pattern traceable to a windswept hillside in ancient Galilee, where disciples gathered around their teacher, hanging on words that would echo through history. The Sermon on the Mount remains perhaps the most revolutionary ethical framework ever articulated. Yet many Christians struggle to connect these principles to their historical impact. Our documentary bridges this gap, following 5 individuals across different centuries whose lives were fundamentally transformed by these teachings, demonstrating how this ancient wisdom continues to offer solutions to our most pressing contemporary problems. The Sermon on the Mount, a revolutionary framework. What if the most profound ethical revolution in human history began with a simple sermon on a hillside in ancient Galilee? To appreciate the radical nature of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we must first understand the socio-political landscape of first-century Palestine. This was a society under Roman occupation, where the imperial presence was not merely political but culturally pervasive. The Roman Empire operated on a strict hierarchical structure that valued power, military might, and social status above all else. Within this imperial framework, Jewish society itself maintained rigid social stratifications, with religious authorities often serving as gatekeepers of moral righteousness and ritual purity. The socio-economic reality of Jesus' Galilee revealed profound disparities. Archaeological excavations in Capernaum show modest dwellings of local black basalt stone standing in the shadow of opulent Roman administrative buildings. Most inhabitants engaged in subsistence fishing, bearing the weight of double taxation from religious authorities and Roman officials. Against this canvas of oppression, like a lamp illuminating a darkened house, Jesus delivered ethical teachings that would transform Western civilization. The Sermon on the Mount presented a systematic inversion of prevailing cultural values. The social order Jesus envisioned directly challenged both Roman imperial ideology and religious establishment norms. The Greek term makarios, blessed, that introduces each beatitude traditionally described the state of gods or ruling elites, yet Jesus deliberately attributed this blessed state to those marginalized by society. Consider how revolutionary it would sound when Jesus declared, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." In a world where land acquisition occurred through conquest or imperial decree, this statement appeared utterly absurd. The concept of praetos, meekness, suggested a gentle strength antithetical to Roman virtues of dominance. Jesus presented this inversion not as utopian fantasy but as divine reality breaking into human history. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. These words stood in profound opposition to the Roman judicial system with its emphasis on retribution. Archaeological evidence throughout the empire reveals how violence functioned as entertainment and social control. Jesus' elevation of mercy represented a fundamental critique of the entire Roman approach to justice and social stability. The pronouncement, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God," carried unmistakable political implications. This teaching directly challenged imperial propaganda that proclaimed the emperor as divine son bringing Pax Romana through military might. The designation Sons of God, with its messianic and royal connotations in Jewish thought, effectively democratized divine sonship beyond the imperial family to those pursuing genuine peace rather than imposed pacification. Biblical scholar David de Silva notes that Jesus redrew the boundaries of honor and shame, creating an alternative community with values diametrically opposed to the surrounding culture. In this honor-shame Mediterranean society, Jesus elevated precisely those characteristics considered shameful, declaring honorable in God's kingdom the very people deemed lowest in society. Jesus' rhetorical approach reinforced his countercultural message. By repeatedly using the formula, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," he positioned himself not merely as teacher but as one claiming authority to reinterpret divine law, either blasphemous or messianic, depending on one's perspective. Among the sermon's most profound challenges was Jesus' command to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In a society defined by tribal and family loyalties, this teaching represented a fundamental reordering of social boundaries, contradicting both Roman policy toward rebellious territories and sectarian attitudes among various Jewish groups. The sermon's economic teachings similarly undermined established systems. Archaeological findings from villa remains in Galilee demonstrate increasing stratification as wealthy landowners accumulated property while peasants struggled under mounting debt. Jesus' teachings about heavenly treasure and his warnings against serving both God and mammon directly challenged economic foundations of Roman society. The enduring transformative power of the sermon derives partly from its unique combination of ethical idealism with practical wisdom. Unlike abstract philosophical treatises, Jesus grounded his vision in ordinary human experiences, anxiety, interpersonal conflict, religious hypocrisy, while simultaneously elevating these mundane concerns to cosmic significance. This integration of transcendent vision with practical application has enabled the sermon to remain revolutionary yet accessible across diverse cultural contexts throughout millennia. Mary Magdalene, dignity restored in a patriarchal world. Beyond his revolutionary ethical teachings, Jesus demonstrated an even more radical departure from societal norms in his treatment of women. Archaeological evidence from first-century Palestine reveals a stark reality. Household artifacts and legal documents consistently positioned women as property, denied basic rights, and relegated them to subordinate roles. In this historical context, the most significant event in Christian history, the resurrection, was first witnessed not by religious authorities or male disciples, but by a woman deemed unreliable by every standard of her time. The status of women in first-century Palestinian society was severe in its restrictions. Women existed primarily as extensions of their male relatives, fathers, husbands, or sons. Their testimonies held no legal weight in courts of law. They were systematically excluded from public religious instruction and confined largely to domestic spheres. This social reality was codified through legal frameworks that reinforced female subordination generation after generation. Mary Magdalene emerges from this oppressive backdrop as a figure of profound theological significance. Her identity has been debated by scholars, with various traditions conflating her with other women mentioned in gospel narratives. What remains undisputed across biblical accounts is her pivotal role as the first witness to the resurrection, Christianity's defining moment. Imagine the scene at dawn. Mary approaches the tomb, her steps heavy with grief. The morning air still carries the chill of night as she discovers the stone rolled away. Confusion mingles with fear as she encounters emptiness where she expected death. In that transformative moment, a woman deemed socially insignificant becomes the bearer of history's most consequential news. The gospel narratives unanimously place her at this empty tomb, entrusted with announcing the resurrection to the male disciples who had fled or hidden themselves following the crucifixion. This assignment represented an extraordinary theological statement. Jesus directly contradicted established societal norms that rendered women's testimonies worthless. The resurrection account deliberately positions a woman as the primary witness to an event that would become the cornerstone of Christian faith, effectively founding a world religion on testimony that contemporary courts would have dismissed without consideration. Jesus' interactions with women consistently violated established social boundaries. His conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well transgressed multiple social taboos simultaneously, a Jewish man speaking publicly with a woman, a religious teacher engaging with a Samaritan, and a respected figure associating with someone of questionable reputation. The disciples' astonishment reveals how profoundly his behavior contradicted social expectations. These interactions formed a consistent pattern throughout Jesus' ministry. Women traveled with him as disciples, a practice that fundamentally contradicted Mediterranean honor codes. In the honor-shame culture of first-century Palestine, a religious teacher allowing women to join his entourage would have invited immediate social censure. Yet the gospel accounts mention several women by name who supported Jesus' ministry both financially and spiritually. The early Christian community's inclusion of women in significant roles suggests that Jesus' revolutionary approach to gender relations influenced his followers' social organization. This inclusion represented a decisive break from both Jewish and Greco-Roman religious traditions that largely excluded women from public religious functions. Evidence shows that subsequent generations attempted to diminish Mary Magdalene's role as apostolic witness. The persistent efforts to redefine her, variously as a prostitute, a sinner, or merely confused, suggest a desire to reconcile the radical gender egalitarianism of early Christianity with the patriarchal structures that re-emerged as the Church developed formal hierarchies. By elevating women to positions of spiritual significance, particularly in the resurrection narrative, Jesus established a theological foundation for female dignity that transcended contemporary cultural limitations. This foundation would influence Christian perspectives on women's capabilities, spirituality, and worth across subsequent centuries, even when institutional practices failed to fully embody these principles. This revolutionary approach transformed women's status throughout subsequent Christian history in complex ways. While institutional Christianity often reverted to patriarchal norms, the underlying theological principle that women could serve as authoritative witnesses to divine truth remained an uncomfortable contradiction within those very institutions. This contradiction created space for recurring movements advocating women's dignity and religious participation throughout Christian history. Jesus' treatment of women fundamentally challenged the social norms of his time, establishing a theological basis for female dignity that would influence subsequent generations and contribute to the evolution of women's rights within Christianity. Bartolomé de las Casas, from slave owner to advocate for mercy. The revolutionary impact of Jesus' teachings extended beyond the 1st century into the heart of Spanish colonialism, where a single sermon would transform a slave owner into history's unexpected champion of indigenous rights. In the tumultuous period of early Spanish conquest in the Americas, when European powers justified exploitation through theological arguments, one man's encounter with the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount would catalyze a profound reversal in thought that continues to influence human rights discourse today. Bartolomé de las Casas arrived in the Americas as a Spanish colonist fully integrated into the exploitative systems of his time. As a landholder under the encomienda system, he directly participated in the subjugation of indigenous peoples, viewing their labor and resources as rightful spoils of conquest. This perspective reflected the colonial mindset that merged economic opportunity with theological justification, a worldview that appeared entirely normal to Las Casas until a pivotal moment altered his perception. The catalyst for this transformation came from a Dominican sermon quoting Jesus' teachings on mercy from the Sermon on the Mount. This encounter with Scripture initiated a profound moral awakening as Las Casas recognized the stark contradiction between colonial practices and Christ's commands regarding mercy. The internal conflict tormented him. How could he claim to follow Jesus while systematically denying mercy to those under his control? His spiritual crisis forced him to reconsider whether the indigenous peoples he exploited were, in truth, his brothers and sisters in humanity. In a dramatic shift from exploitation to empathy, Las Casas redefined what it meant to embrace mercy. He relinquished his encomienda holdings, sacrificing considerable wealth and status, and began to see indigenous peoples as fellow bearers of divine image rather than commodities. His transformation transcended mere sentiment, becoming a comprehensive theological reframing of how Christian principles should govern human relationships across cultural boundaries. Las Casas devoted the remainder of his life to systematic advocacy for those he had once exploited. His seminal work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, documented atrocities committed against indigenous populations while explicitly drawing from Jesus' teachings on mercy as its theological framework. The text served dual purposes: historical documentation and theological argument. Las Casas wrote with unflinching clarity, "What authority did you have to make such detestable war against these people who were quietly and peacefully living in their own land?" His pointed questions revealed how colonial practices fundamentally violated Christ's teachings. Where contemporaries employed Scripture to justify conquest, Las Casas reinterpreted Christian theology to condemn exploitation. His application of the Sermon on the Mount to colonial contexts suggested that Jesus' command to show mercy extended across cultural and racial boundaries. This theological reframing challenged prevailing interpretations that had conveniently excluded indigenous peoples from Christian ethical concern. Las Casas faced formidable opposition from those invested in colonial systems. Colonial authorities and fellow clergymen had constructed elaborate justifications for exploitation, often portraying indigenous peoples as inherently inferior. Against these entrenched interests, Las Casas advocated persistently for recognition of indigenous humanity and dignity. His advocacy extended beyond written criticism to direct political engagement. He traveled repeatedly between the Americas and Spain, bringing his case to the Spanish court and arguing for legal protections for indigenous communities. These efforts culminated in the historic Valladolid debate of 1550 to 1551, where Las Casas confronted Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda regarding the humanity and rights of indigenous peoples. The Valladolid debate represents a pivotal moment in human rights development. Las Casas' position that indigenous peoples possessed rational souls and inherent dignity directly challenged prevailing justifications for conquest. By insisting that all humans, regardless of cultural background, deserved protection from cruelty, Las Casas established theological groundwork for concepts that would later evolve into human rights frameworks. What makes this historical development particularly significant is how Jesus' teaching on mercy provided the foundation for broader recognition of human dignity. Las Casas arguments emerged from within the colonial system itself, demonstrating how religious principles could function as internal critique of imperial practices. His transformation, from participant in exploitation to advocate for the exploited, illustrates how Jesus' teachings could fundamentally reorient an individual's relationship to power systems, challenging the assumptions that justified structural injustice. The implications of Las Casas' conversion extend into contemporary human rights discourse. His application of Jesus' teachings established precedent for universal principles of human dignity. The revolutionary potential of Jesus' teachings became evident in Las Casas' ability to recognize humanity in those his culture had systematically dehumanized. The monastic scholars, preserving knowledge through dark ages. As Roman power waned across Europe in the 5th century, a profound intellectual crisis emerged alongside political fragmentation. Libraries fell into disrepair, schools closed their doors, and the sophisticated educational system that had characterized the classical world began to disappear. In this gathering darkness, an unexpected force would become civilization's intellectual lifeline, not armies or emperors, but quiet communities of monks guided by a theological principle drawn from Christ's teaching to love God with all your mind. The collapse of Roman infrastructure threatened centuries of accumulated knowledge. Literacy rates plummeted dramatically, with classical texts, repositories of philosophy, science, literature, and history, facing extinction as institutions crumbled. Within monastery walls, dedicated spaces called scriptoria became sanctuaries of learning. Picture Brother Matthias, hunched over a manuscript of Cicero's orations, his fingers stained with ink, eyes straining in the dim light of a single window. The scratch of his quill on parchment breaks the profound silence as he carefully forms each letter, understanding his work as a devotional act, a fulfillment of Christ's command to love God intellectually. These monk copyists worked with extraordinary patience, each manuscript demanding months of meticulous transcription. Like lamplighters in a vast darkness, they preserved the flickering flames of knowledge that might otherwise have been extinguished forever. Their labor constituted both practical necessity and spiritual discipline, transforming intellectual pursuit into divine worship. This theological principle rendered scholarship itself an expression of devotion to God. The monastic preservation effort proved essential for works by Aristotle and Cicero. The manuscripts produced in these scriptoria often represent the only surviving transmission of texts fundamental to Western intellectual tradition. Had these documents perished during the political upheaval of the early medieval period, the Renaissance's recovery of classical learning would have been impossible. These monks served as civilization's archivists, carefully tending the seeds of knowledge through Europe's intellectual winter. The Venerable Bede exemplified the monastic scholar who preserved existing knowledge while advancing original scholarship. His Ecclesiastical History of the English People provided a comprehensive account of early English history, demonstrating how monastic intellectual traditions produced new knowledge while preserving ancient wisdom. Bede's work integrated rigorous historical methodology with theological reflection, embodying the synthesis of faith and learning characteristic of monastic scholarship. Alcuin of York made profound contributions during the Carolingian Renaissance, serving as intellectual architect for Charlemagne's educational reforms. His efforts to establish schools and develop curriculum based on classical texts established foundations for Europe's educational future. Alcuin's educational program would eventually evolve into cathedral schools that preceded universities, demonstrating how monastic intellectual commitments shaped broader society. Women also played significant roles in this intellectual enterprise. Hildegard of Bingen's contributions to music, medicine, and theology revealed the inclusive nature of monastic intellectual life. Her writings engaged deeply with intellectual traditions while offering original insights across multiple disciplines. Hildegard's example challenges simplistic narratives about medieval intellectual life, demonstrating that theological commitment to loving God with all your mind transcended gender boundaries. The monastic intellectual tradition ultimately birthed Europe's earliest universities. The founding documents of institutions like the University of Paris and Oxford reveal direct connections to monastic educational practices. These universities maintained the monastic emphasis on theology and liberal arts while gradually expanding to encompass new fields of inquiry. The structure of university education, with its emphasis on textual analysis, disputation, and comprehensive understanding, reveals its monastic heritage. Medieval theologians interpreted Jesus' command to love God with one's mind as explicit justification for intellectual pursuits across disciplines. Knowledge was understood not as merely practical, but as inherently valuable, a means of honoring the divine through intellectual exploration. This theological understanding created space for comprehensive education that valued knowledge across disciplines. The monastic commitment to education gradually transformed European literacy, creating new pathways for learning beyond elite circles. Like tributaries flowing from a great river, monastic educational traditions eventually evolved into university systems that would circle the globe, bearing the imprint of their theological origins even as they adapted to new cultural contexts. This intellectual preservation carried implications far beyond Europe's borders. Had Jesus' teaching about loving God with all your mind not inspired these communities, many classical works might have vanished completely, fundamentally altering the development of Western thought. The monk's quill, guided by devotion, preserved civilization's memory when all other institutions failed. Isaac Newton, faith as foundation for scientific inquiry. The theological foundations that supported monastic scholarship would find perhaps their most profound expression in the scientific revolution. While we typically envision Isaac Newton as the archetypal scientist, a rational mind meticulously observing falling apples and formulating mathematical laws, a closer examination of his life reveals something far more nuanced. What if the mind behind the laws of physics was also a devout seeker of divine truth? Newton's revolutionary principles of motion and universal gravitation fundamentally transformed our understanding of the physical universe, emerging from a foundation of theological conviction. Newton's scientific achievements stand as monumental contributions to human knowledge. His laws of motion and gravitational theory unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics. His work in optics demonstrated that white light contains the full spectrum of colors, and his mathematical innovations, particularly calculus, provided powerful tools for describing natural phenomena. These contributions form the bedrock of classical physics. Yet behind these scientific breakthroughs stood a man whose intellectual energies were primarily directed toward theological inquiry. Historical scholarship reveals a startling truth that contradicts popular conceptions of Newton. He wrote significantly more on theology and biblical interpretation than on scientific subjects. His theological manuscripts, many unpublished during his lifetime, fill thousands of pages with meticulous analyses of scripture, church history, and prophetic interpretation. This apparent paradox resolves when we understand Newton's fundamental worldview, one in which scientific and theological disciplines functioned as complementary branches of the same tree, both rooted in the pursuit of divine truth. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made, Newton wrote, drawing from the Gospel of John. This biblical foundation shaped his approach to scientific investigation as a form of reverential inquiry. In his personal correspondence and unpublished writings, he expressed the belief that studying natural phenomena constituted a sacred endeavor, a means of comprehending the Creator's design. For Newton, deciphering the mathematical principles governing planetary motion or understanding the properties of light represented forms of divine worship. This theological foundation shaped Newton's scientific methodology. His confidence in discovering coherent natural laws stemmed from his conviction that the universe was established by a rational God who designed creation to function according to comprehensible principles. As Newton investigated gravitational attraction or optical phenomena, he operated with the fundamental assumption that orderly patterns awaited discovery precisely because an orderly mind had implemented them in nature. Even in his landmark work, the Principia Mathematica, Newton concludes with theological reflections on God's relationship to space and time. For Newton, scientific laws described how God typically operates in nature, while miracles represented extraordinary divine interventions outside these regular patterns. Newton's integration of faith and reason was representative of a broader intellectual movement during the scientific revolution. Contemporary figures like Robert Boyle, Johannes Kepler, and René Descartes similarly pursued scientific inquiry within theological frameworks. These pioneers viewed the natural world as God's second book, a divine revelation complementary to Scripture. Careful observation of nature could reveal aspects of divine wisdom, power, and design that complemented biblical teachings. This historical perspective challenges modern assumptions about an inherent conflict between religious faith and scientific inquiry. The pioneers of modern science understood scientific investigation as revealing the mechanisms through which divine intelligence operated in creation. The very concept of discovering laws of nature, presupposed a lawgiver whose rational mind established consistent patterns throughout the universe. The artificial separation between science and faith emerged primarily during the Enlightenment and intensified in the 19th century. As scientific institutions became increasingly secularized and professionalized, the theological motivations that had inspired early scientific pioneers were gradually obscured. This historical revisionism often portrayed science as having advanced despite religious interference rather than recognizing how theological commitments provided the philosophical foundation for scientific methodology. The case of Newton reveals the limitations of such simplistic narratives. His scientific achievements cannot be fully understood without recognizing how his theological worldview provided both motivation and methodological foundations for his research. Newton approached nature with reverence and systematic rigor precisely because he believed the universe exhibited divine rationality. The mathematical principles he discovered were expressions of God's consistent governance of creation. This historical insight offers a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between faith and reason. Rather than representing opposing approaches, they functioned as complementary domains in Newton's intellectual framework, branches of the same tree, with deep roots in theological conviction and a vast canopy of scientific discovery, both seeking understanding of the divine order. Desmond Tutu, embodying peacemaking in post-apartheid South Africa. Faith's capacity to transform extends beyond intellectual pursuits into the realm of national healing. When Archbishop Desmond Tutu confronted the seemingly insurmountable challenge of reconciliation in post-apartheid South Africa, he proposed something that many considered naive or even dangerous. Applying Jesus' radical teachings on forgiveness to a nation traumatized by generations of institutionalized racism. The air in South Africa during the early 1990s was thick with tension and uncertainty. "We could taste the fear," recalled one resident of Soweto. White families worried about retribution. Black families carried generations of wounds. We all wondered, how do we live together now? The formal dismantling of apartheid had ended the legal framework of racial segregation, but the deeper wounds remained unaddressed. How could a society move forward when perpetrators of horrific human rights abuses lived alongside their victims? Conventional retributive justice, punishment proportional to the crime, would have likely perpetuated cycles of violence in a nation already fractured along racial lines. In this precarious moment, Archbishop Desmond Tutu emerged as the moral architect of an unprecedented experiment in national healing. As chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at TRC, Tutu established a framework that prioritized truth-telling, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and the possibility of forgiveness. This approach was profoundly theological, rooted explicitly in Tutu's understanding of Jesus' teachings on reconciliation. The theological foundation of the TRC manifested in Tutu's public statements and writings. He framed the Commission's work within Christian principles, drawing particularly from the Beatitudes. Commission proceedings often began with prayer, and Tutu regularly cited Jesus' teachings on mercy and peacemaking as spiritual justification for the process. For Tutu, the TRC created a sacred space where forgiveness could manifest. Central to Tutu's framework was the African concept of Ubuntu, which he integrated with Christian principles. Ubuntu emphasizes the interconnectedness of humanity, articulated by Tutu as "a person is a person through other persons." This philosophical concept aligned with Jesus' emphasis on community and restored relationships. "My humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up, in yours," Tutu explained. "We belong in a bundle of life." This integration provided the foundation for the TRC's approach to restorative justice. Rather than viewing justice as punishment, Tutu's framework defined justice as relationship restoration. This perspective allowed the Commission to prioritize truth-telling as a step toward healing. Perpetrators who fully disclosed their crimes could be granted amnesty, but only after confronting their victims and acknowledging the harm caused. Ubuntu manifested powerfully in the case of Namand Kalada, whose husband was one of the Cradock 4 activists murdered by white police officers. During their confession, she wept uncontrollably. Later, after hearing their full disclosure, she expressed forgiveness toward the perpetrators. This extraordinary act demonstrated the transformative potential of Tutu's approach. Another notable case involved former police officer Jeffrey Benzian, who demonstrated before the Commission the wet bag torture technique he had used. He faced his former victims and acknowledged his actions. The confrontation itself, the truth acknowledged, represented a crucial step toward healing that would have been impossible in a purely retributive system. Tutu's application of Jesus' teachings extended beyond frameworks into his personal approach. He modeled the forgiveness he advocated. When criticized, Tutu referenced the Sermon on the Mount, particularly Jesus' teaching on forgiveness and loving one's enemies. For Tutu, these were practical guidelines for reconstructing a broken society. The theological basis became most evident in Tutu's references to the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, and blessed are the merciful became foundational texts for the Commission's work. In his view, creating peace required the active restoration of relationships through truth-telling, justice, and forgiveness. This approach represented a contextual application of Jesus' teachings to address the specific wounds of a post-apartheid society. The TRC has inspired similar approaches to reconciliation in countries like Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Colombia. While scholarly assessments remain mixed, its contribution to preventing widespread violence following apartheid is widely acknowledged. Like earlier examples of faith transforming intellect and ethics, Tutu demonstrated how ancient teachings could inform contemporary approaches to conflict resolution on a national scale. What makes Tutu's application particularly significant is its demonstration that principles of forgiveness can function not merely individually but as foundations for national policy. By integrating theological concepts into a political framework, Tutu showed how they could be operationalized to address profound societal wounds. The South African experiment suggests that theological frameworks, thoughtfully applied and contextualized, may provide unique resources for reconciliation where conventional political approaches prove insufficient. Modern humanitarian work, ancient teachings in contemporary action. When natural disasters devastate communities and humanitarian crises unfold across continents, massive relief operations mobilize with remarkable efficiency. Yet behind the logistics, supply chains, and emergency protocols of today's largest humanitarian organizations lies something unexpected, an ancient spiritual imperative that has quietly shaped centuries of compassionate action. The connection between words spoken on a Galilean hillside 2 millennia ago and contemporary humanitarian frameworks reveals one of history's most enduring ethical legacies. The scale of modern humanitarian challenges is staggering. Currently, over 100 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide, an unprecedented figure in recorded history. Nearly 800 million people face food insecurity, while climate-related disasters affect approximately 200 million annually. These statistics represent profound human suffering that demands a coordinated global response. Religious motivations, particularly those derived from Jesus' teachings, underpin the operational philosophies of many prominent international relief organizations. Faith-based organizations contribute approximately 40% of all international humanitarian aid, forming a substantial pillar of the global safety net for vulnerable populations. This influence extends beyond historical roots to actively shape contemporary mission statements, organizational cultures, and strategic priorities. But how does an ancient sermon still echo in today's relief work? Like a tapestry whose intricate patterns evolved from a single inspirational thread, modern humanitarian networks trace their essential character to foundational spiritual concepts. Founding documents and current mission statements provide illuminating evidence of this theological foundation. World Vision, operating in nearly 100 countries, explicitly grounds its mission in Jesus' command to serve those in need. Their mission statement references their commitment to follow our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in working with the poor and oppressed. This guiding principle shapes their approach to development, emergency relief, and advocacy. Similarly, Compassion International frames its child sponsorship programs as a direct response to Jesus' teachings about care for the vulnerable. Catholic Relief Services, serving over 130 million people in more than 100 countries, articulates its mission as an expression of the Church's commitment to embody Jesus' teachings on love and justice through concrete actions. The theological foundation for this humanitarian imperative derives significantly from Matthew 25, where Jesus identifies himself with the hungry, thirsty, homeless, naked, sick, and imprisoned, declaring, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." This text establishes an unambiguous link between serving human need and honoring the divine, a link that continues to motivate countless humanitarian workers. Field staff frequently cite this teaching as their primary motivation for service, even in dangerous circumstances. A program director with decades of experience in conflict zones expressed, "When I see a displaced family who has lost everything, I hear Christ's words about the least of these. My faith demands that I help." This theological framing transforms humanitarian assistance from charity into spiritual imperative. The historical development of Christian humanitarian organizations reveals an evolution from localized charity to global assistance networks. Medieval hospitals and almshouses administered by religious orders established organizational patterns that would eventually evolve into modern humanitarian infrastructures. These institutions operated under the Benedictine principle of receiving each stranger as Christ himself. By the 19th century, missionary movements established more systematic approaches to addressing poverty, disease, and lack of education. Organizations like the Red Cross originated from explicitly Christian motivations when Henri Dunant, witnessing the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino, was moved by his Christian convictions to establish what became one of history's most significant humanitarian organizations. The post-World War II period witnessed an explosion of faith-based international relief organizations that expanded dramatically while maintaining their spiritual foundations. What distinguishes these organizations is their emphasis on holistic transformation, addressing both physical and spiritual dimensions of human experience. While secular humanitarian principles focus primarily on material needs, many faith-based organizations view their work through a theological lens that recognizes human dignity as deriving from divine creation. The impact of this theological foundation extends to individual vocational choices. Humanitarian workers frequently describe feeling called to their profession, language that reflects their understanding of service as a response to divine initiative rather than merely career advancement. This vocational framing often sustains commitment through challenging circumstances that might otherwise lead to burnout. Across centuries, we observe how ancient teachings about compassion have been institutionalized through organizational structures capable of addressing complex modern crises. The imperative to feed the hungry has evolved from individual almsgiving to sophisticated food security programs. The command to care for the sick has developed from simple hospice care to comprehensive health systems that continue to echo Jesus' enduring call to serve the least of these. Patterns of transformation, the consistent impact across centuries. Beyond institutional structures and humanitarian systems, a more profound pattern emerges when examining individual lives transformed across 20 centuries of Christian history. While scholars debate whether these patterns represent mere coincidence or evidence of consistent spiritual principles at work, remarkable similarities between figures from vastly different historical eras challenge conventional explanations of historical discontinuity. When analyzing historical figures from Mary Magdalene to Desmond Tutu, several consistent patterns emerge that transcend cultural boundaries and historical periods. These patterns suggest a systematic transformative mechanism rather than random parallelism. The recurring transformative sequences follow similar trajectories despite vast differences in historical context, resembling recurring motifs in a grand symphony where distinct movements share thematic elements while adapting to different emotional landscapes. These patterns can be organized into 4 distinct but interconnected categories. First, personal transformation consistently precedes broader social reform. Bartolomé de las Casas experienced an ethical awakening through Jesus' teachings on mercy before advocating for indigenous rights. Similarly, Desmond Tutu's personal commitment to reconciliation principles informed his establishment of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This pattern, personal conviction leading to institutional reform, operates with remarkable reliability across different cultural environments, suggesting an underlying spiritual mechanism at work. Second, the elevation of human dignity regardless of social status constitutes another recognizable pattern. From Jesus' interactions with women in a patriarchal society to Las Casas' advocacy for indigenous peoples, we observe a persistent elevation of human worth transcending prevailing cultural assumptions. Academic research demonstrates that the consistent emphasis on human dignity in Jesus' teachings has been a driving force behind movements advocating for women's rights and equality. This recognition of universal human dignity appears in contexts where such concepts were culturally anomalous, establishing foundations for expanded concepts of equality that would develop in later Christian contexts. Third, these transformations consistently reconcile apparent opposites that conventional wisdom presents as irreconcilable tensions. Newton integrated scientific inquiry with theological commitment. Tutu synthesized justice requirements with mercy imperatives. Rather than compartmentalizing faith and reason, justice and mercy, or peace and truth, figures influenced by Jesus' teachings develop frameworks that harmonize these tensions into integrated approaches, challenging assumptions that religious commitment operates in opposition to rational inquiry. Fourth, these figures consistently encountered opposition from established power structures. From the early church's persecution under Roman authorities to Martin Luther King Jr.'s confrontation with segregationist systems, transformative application of Jesus' teachings reliably generates resistance from institutional powers. This pattern reveals the inherently challenging nature of these teachings when authentically applied. They consistently disrupt established hierarchies and challenge prevailing assumptions about who deserves dignity, voice, and agency. The consistency of these patterns challenges the common scholarly assumption that religious teachings function primarily as cultural artifacts evolving with changing historical circumstances. Instead, evidence suggests core principles articulated in Jesus' teachings maintain their transformative potency across radically different contexts, generating similar patterns despite vast differences in cultural environment. What emerges is not merely a collection of inspiring historical anecdotes, but evidence of a consistent transformative mechanism operating across diverse contexts with remarkable reliability. Like a river flowing through varied landscapes while maintaining its essential character, these principles adapt to new terrain while preserving their transformative power. This analysis invites personal reflection. How might these ancient principles illuminate our contemporary challenges? If these teachings have consistently generated transformative outcomes throughout history, what resources might they offer for addressing our current social divisions and moral dilemmas? The evidence suggests their enduring relevance, as principles of love, forgiveness, and human dignity continue to inspire action against modern challenges like poverty and inequality. These patterns invite us to consider not merely the historical significance of Jesus' influence, but its potential application to the moral and social questions that confront us in our own lives and communities today. Throughout our journey exploring the transformative influence of Jesus' teachings, we've witnessed a remarkable pattern emerge, one that transcends mere historical significance. What we find is a living framework for human flourishing that continues to address our most complex contemporary challenges. These principles simultaneously affirm human dignity, challenge systemic injustice, and promote reconciliation without compromising truth. Their enduring relevance lies in their adaptability across diverse cultural contexts, offering practical wisdom for our unprecedented global challenges, from environmental degradation to economic inequality. How might these teachings transform your community today? As we conclude, consider what radical compassion would look like in your context, creating spaces of justice, mercy, and mutual flourishing.